Before a rare genetic disorder is diagnosed, many of our children receive an autism diagnosis. Some of us even had to challenge the doctors for the autism diagnosis because it didn't quite fit with our children's symptoms. Even while it didn't always seem spot on. So after receiving genetic diagnosis, are they still autistic? What does one diagnosis, or where does one diagnosis end and the other one begin? Can they co-occur? This has been a point of conversation with some of our families online. So I invited Dr. Taylor Day here, a licensed psychologist, to talk about what goes into an autism diagnosis and what does it mean when your child is diagnosed autistic and then diagnosed as having rare gene disorder. I've also talked to her about some common features of individuals with CMYND11, the eloping, the fight or flight response, the behavioral challenges. Dr. Tay specializes in neurodiversity affirming support for autistic children, teens, adults, and their families, having herself come from a family impacted by autism. Thank you so much, Dr. Tay, for joining us today. And I'm gonna stop sharing.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. Well, yeah, I'm excited to be here. I am actually on a vacation right now. So if you hear background noise, I tried to find a quiet spot in order to be able to come up and share with y'all today. I'd love to hear in the chat as a starting point, just so I can tailor this a little bit. Put a 1 if your child has been diagnosed with autism, and put a 2 if they have not been diagnosed with autism, just so I have a general sense. Okay. Definitely some mix here. Okay. Awesome. Okay. For those that are singing 2, so there's actually, I'd say more 2s than 1s. Is autism, you can put a Y for yes and an N for no. Is autism something that you're considering or you're suspecting as part of this? 2, but no test yet. Yes, no. Okay. So some variability, a little bit more yes than no. Okay. That's super helpful. Now, one of the things, so, my area of specialization absolutely is within autism. So I have been spending a little bit of time researching more about this genetic condition and some of the overlap, and just trying to get a sense of this. And, there are ultimately a lot of common features. And one of the things, though, at the same point, is we know that there are genetic conditions that significantly increase the likelihood of autism. And, when I hear things, and we're going to go through some diagnostic criteria today as some of this, I'd also like to talk about some of these support strategies. So as I was logging on, I heard you guys already talking about AAC and apraxia. It's interesting in my research, and granted, I didn't do a huge deep dive, but with the hypotonia, I was like, oh, I bet there's this apraxia overlap, that is going on, especially with some of the speech and language delays that are often so, co-occurring. But things like, with like the elopement, for example, or aggression, we can commonly see that in autistic children. Feeding difficulties, I found, it was part of this often as well. And then sometimes we can have like intellectual disabilities, learning disabilities also, which commonly co-occur with autism. And then, I think, is it Disa? Is that how I say your name? Okay, I thought so. I just wanted to double check. I was watching your video too of you even talking about your daughter, of like almost how she's hyper social, and that sometimes can be like, well, is this autism? And that is one of the things. There's also commonly regression that happens, and we see that with autism as well. And I think one of the things that I want to do today is give the context of how broad autism can look. I think a lot of times when we're hearing education about autism, it's more of these stereotypical patterns. And so when you hear things like Disa in one of the presentations described her daughter of being hypersocial and really affectionate, you will get providers that are like, oh no, they can't be autistic. And what I will tell you is having, I couldn't tell you how many kids I've diagnosed at this point, at least hundreds, maybe up to 1,000. And so I've really had the opportunity to see such a variability in how this presents. But when I launched my own private practice, ultimately, we tend to get a lot of what we consider high masking individuals, where their traits are more subtle. A lot of girls tend to come to us in particular because other providers have been saying, no, there's no way this is autism. But parents in their gut are still going, but I still see things, right? I feel like something is missing here. And for all of you at this point, you're either suspecting, I'm assuming, this genetic condition or it's been diagnosed. And so there might be a question of, is this even beneficial in order to get autism diagnosed? And again, in my research, one of the things that I learned about this genetic condition is it's so rare, it doesn't even have a name. And so that means so few people are going to know about it. And this is where I feel like if the autism diagnostic criteria fits, I would, recommend pursuing that diagnosis because it ultimately is going to unlock more supports, more services, and helping you to get, that full support overall. I think autism tends to be one of the better recognized and supported like conditions, so to speak. Desiree, so Amanda says my girl is hypersocial, and I will respond to comments. I want this to be free flowing. Desiree, we have been told repeatedly that he has autistic traits, but not enough to diagnose. He can be super social and not always, but not always, and is super affectionate. So one of the things that I'm going to do, I have a QR code later, but if you guys want to pull this up, I'm going to give you guys a link, and I have a downloadable Google Doc that breaks down diagnostic criteria and all the various ways that autism can present, and some of these like more subtle traits. Because I hear this a lot when families are told, okay, they have all these autistic traits, but they don't have this. Like a lot of times it's like, okay, but sometimes we need to dive deeper. For example, we have to have differences in nonverbal communication, which often we think of eye contact, facial expressions, gestures. And so sometimes I'll hear parents being like, yeah, you didn't get a diagnosis, or she didn't get a diagnosis because she's making eye contact. And it's like, okay, that's one element of how we can meet that piece of the diagnostic criteria. But one of the things that can come into play, especially, like this hypersocial piece, is sometimes what we see is these differences in nonverbal communication can often be even like body distance, right? And what they're doing with their body, and often encroaching on other people's personal spaces, or, going up and hugging them all the time, right? So we can have these really social, affectionate behaviors, and it still could be autism ultimately. So let's dive in a little bit. Hypersocial is something is associated to Williams syndrome. Yeah, something my son was thought to have until we got genetic testing done. Exactly. Yeah, and so there's a lot of overlap. But with Williams syndrome, there's also a significantly higher rate of autism within that population as well. And so, one of the things that we do know about autism is that there is a strong genetic underpinning, strong genetic cause, right? And now we haven't identified all of the genes that contribute to autism, but we do know that certain genetic presentations increase the likelihood. And I think that that's some of what some of you all may be experiencing, where it is at a significantly higher rate or a higher likelihood than, a population that doesn't have a genetic condition. So ultimately, for a diagnosis of autism, we have to have two different buckets. We have to, and I should mention, I am totally fine. If you guys want to put questions in the chat, we'll have time for Q&A at the end, but feel free as I'm talking if something pops up. Our first diagnosis was with a developmental pediatrician, was autistic traits, but it better explained by the genetic disorder. But we have gone back twice for further testing and received the diagnosis outright. Yeah. My son was diagnosed with genetic disorder from epilepsy, but was tested for autism. His tests come back borderline. And because there was a connection, yeah, he was given the autism diagnosis. So, yeah, and sometimes professionals will navigate this in different ways. And while it is important, we do this process of what we call differential diagnosis, where we're not just giving diagnoses, and like having them stack on top of each other. There's a delicate balance with that. Again, like I said, I find that autism often unlocks various understanding, access to services, that ZMYND11 would not, because so few professionals. And so when Disa asked me to do this, I was like, I can do it, but this is not something I'm familiar with. I'm happy to do some research and then we can talk about the overlap. We had autism diagnosis at age 6. Then we did genetic testing, dismissed for years at first until a regression. Yeah. And unfortunately, sometimes there have to be these big things that happen in order to get that recognition. And what I want to emphasize to you all, especially those who haven't gotten the autism diagnosis yet. I do promise, even if you do, I think understanding the diagnostic criteria, downloading the free guide will help you better understand your child's pattern of autistic traits as well. But I want to emphasize something that's really, really important, that if you are told no and you are in your gut, you're going, right, but everything I read and I learn, it feels like it. Keep going. I promise you, there are providers out there who will listen and validate your experience and help you dive deeper. And while, it's so variable of what type, I also want to remind you the type of providers that do autism diagnostic evaluations. So, developmental peds is really common. Pediatricians tend to refer to developmental pediatricians. They're just more specialized pediatricians and really know neurodevelopmental conditions, plus the whole medical scope. I also think you all as a group are more likely to be referred to um, developmental peds because of that medical overlap. And what I often find is developmental pediatricians tend to, I am kind of giving a blanket statement, so there are exceptions to this, but they tend to see more of the stereotypical presentations of autism, where it's like, okay, yeah, this kid is clearly autistic, let's diagnose it. And sometimes parents have a hard time when their kid doesn't fit that stereotypical presentation, then getting that recognition. And so you also can go to someone like myself as a licensed psychologist. We, that's within our specialty. Sometimes you can get even psychiatrists, for example, or you can get, like mental health clinicians. Sometimes it's variable, but I would say the two primary groups are developmental peds and psychology that tend to diagnose. Okay, catching up. Diagnosed with autism at 6 years old in the US, sadly, genetic syndromes doesn't give you the funding. Yep, that autism does. So that diagnosis definitely unlocked more funding, especially Medicaid, which helps us with funding therapy, especially with ABA. Absolutely. Yeah, don't challenge the autism diagnosis. It can help. Yeah, I agree. It helps with unlocking services and just in general, that understanding. And yeah, and then we're talking about AAC, which I'm actually going to talk a little bit about AAC as well, but it sounds like you guys have been diving in, but I at least wanted, to mention it. All right, so let's dive into diagnostic criteria. So we have two buckets, right? We have to satisfy both of these buckets. In bucket number 1, we have to have what are called differences in social communication and interaction. One thing I want to note for y'all as I'm talking today, you're going to notice that I'm going to use the word difference a lot, or autistic, and that's because I use a neurodiversity affirming approach, really focused on, how do we help understand the support needs, but then also not frame it in a way that something is broken or needs to be fixed as a result of this. And so how we diagnose is based on the diagnostic, the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, 5th edition. And that will say deficits, but I tend to steer away from that language. So differences, in the DSM, it would say deficits in social communication and interaction. So with this bucket A, we have that. Bucket B is the presence of what we call restricted or stereotyped patterns of behaviors, interests, and movements. And so we're going to dive into more of what that looks like as well. So though we have to satisfy both buckets, we have to fully fill them up before we're able to say like, yes, this child is meeting diagnostic criteria for autism. In bucket A, then we have three different areas we have to satisfy and that we're looking for. Number one is differences in nonverbal communication. Like I said, this tends to be eye contact, facial expressions, gestures. It can be body language. It can be, body spacing and all of that. Number two are differences in social reciprocity or social emotional reciprocity. That's that back and forth conversation or play. And we'll dive into what each of these look like a little bit more. And then the third one is differences in developing, understanding, and maintaining relationships. So again, we have to have all three of those satisfied in order to even say that bucket A is meeting criteria. My daughter is hypersocial too. Her geneticist has prescribed her to test for Williams syndrome and it came negative. Okay. And then that's when you got the diagnosis. Okay. As you mentioned, there's a larger autism community, and when a child is diagnosed as autistic, many doors open. Yep. When we only mention genetic, people don't understand what we're talking about. As a result, the child may be left without essential tools. Absolutely. Could you suggest how we can convey the message clearly to the diagnostician, specifically how to point out similarities between the genetic syndrome and autistic characteristics? The objective is to ensure that the child receives all available support. So what I would recommend doing, honestly, is downloading this free guide and taking notes on it, checking off the way in which you see your child, presents and is meeting criteria. Here's the thing I would recommend is rather than focusing on how this is different from the genetic condition, I would just focus on how your child is meeting diagnostic criteria for autism. And if you can really come prepared to lay this out and be like, look, I have examples of all of this. I also, not everyone necessarily would recommend this, but I would because I'm a big proponent of y'all are the experts of your children. This might be what I have chosen to specialize in, but you are the one that knows your child best. And so don't be afraid during the doctor's appointment or the testing, if you're in the room with the child, to be like, oh, did you see how they did this? Like that, that's what I see on a day-to-day basis. Like that's their form of stimming, and pull this out. And again, I know this is putting the onus on you to really have the knowledge, which is frustrating because you feel like, okay, I want to be able to rely on, professionals to tell me. But my guess is, and what I've learned, about ZMYND11 is you guys have always had to be in that driver's seat of like educating. And it's probably rare, that you're really getting that education. I think Disa, you even talked about that in your presentation. And so this could be where you take some time to really dive in and better understand what is going on so that you can then point it out to the professionals. So, and if they're really focused on, listen, this is the genetic condition, this is what we expect, I would come back and really emphasize, right, but they're meeting diagnostic criteria for autism. It commonly overlaps. And it's super important that my child gets access to services and this is what they're needing, and we're not getting that access with just the genetic condition alone. So that's the way that I would frame it. Okay, so let's talk about then, we talked about bucket A. What are some examples of hypersocial children? Because this seems to be the pattern overall. So this may be a child that, constantly like differences in developing, understanding, and maintaining relationships. This could look like, someone could ask you, well, does your kid have friends? Do they show interest in peers? And you're like, yeah. And it's like, oh, someone could be like, that's not autism, but it absolutely can be. And I see this all the time, that sometimes what this looks like is they're really good at initiating these interactions and seeking in out these connections, but then they don't know necessarily always how to maintain this in a flexible way. So it could be they're going up to all these kids on the playground, and then another kid starts running and they're like, what am I supposed to do? And maybe they're chasing and trying to follow along, but it's this difference and this difficulty with maintaining that social interaction. And so you can have an autistic child who is highly like socially interested, but this is where and I should have framed this. I like to think of this area. Sometimes we have what I call quantity traits and sometimes what I call quality traits. What I mean by this, those quantity traits are those stereotypical presentations, like a yes, no. Does your child make eye contact? Yes. Do they have friends? Yes. Can you have a conversation with them? Yes. Do they play with toys? Yes. And it's like, okay, then someone's like, this is an autism. But what does the quality of that look like? So with peers, yeah, they have friends, but what does that friendship look like? Is it flexible? Are they able to really maintain it? If it goes outside, sometimes we'll see a lot of rigidity too with peers of being like, I'm going to tell you exactly what I need you to do. But then if you don't do that, that's one, it's dysregulating. And two, your child may not know how to respond to all of that. Okay, I'm glad this is resonating of like some of the ways that this can present. So she calls everyone her age of friend and will repeat what they do, but I don't think they realize she is playing. Yeah, absolutely. So sometimes it's missing that reciprocity and that maintenance. And depending what age your child is, too, I really want to emphasize this is sometimes these traits may seem very subtle when kids are young because we write them off of like, right, but okay, but kids do that. That's cute, right? Like, or no, they'll figure it out. But what starts to happen, I would say, especially for girls or just hypersocial kids in general, I start to see around that 7 to 8 year age range is when they end up seeking out an evaluation. Because what happens to social circles is they go from everyone's included to right around that third grade mark. There's some big changes that happen and kids are starting to, really cluster off and make friends and not everyone's included. And that's sometimes, unfortunately, when the right supports aren't in place, you may see your child really start to struggle, right? Where they don't fully fit in with any group. And, I know it's hard as a parent. Sometimes they're not getting invited to birthday parties, or if they are, you can definitely tell your child's just trying to like follow along and figure it out, or is trying to control the situation of being like, this is how we play. And if it goes outside of that, it's difficult. Another example, so that's kind of more the relationships as an example. And again, there's tons in this document. I want to just give you a primer today. The differences in nonverbal communication. So I already talked about like the body spacing and just kind of body like spatial awareness and all of that. But we also can see it in a way that, okay, eye contact. This is again where it could be a quality trait as opposed to a quantity trait. So if someone asks you, does your autistic child make eye contact? It's like, yeah, they make eye contact. Okay, but what does that eye contact look like? Is it flexible? For example, are they quickly looking at you and then their eye contact is drifting, so it's not sustained? Is it if they're talking about their special interest and what they're super passionate about, they're making eye contact, but if you're trying to introduce something or you're trying to get their attention, it's more difficult to catch the eye contact too. And so this can be a great example of where, again, like hyper social, of like, yeah, they'll look, but sometimes I find with these hyper social kids, they almost stare too, of like, they just like intensely stare at you. And so that's not like well regulated eye contact. It should feel a little bit more flow. Or sometimes I get kids where they've been taught to make eye contact. But if you really pay attention, and if your child has spoken language and some insight, you can ask them, when people are talking to you, where do you look at? And sometimes I'll notice kids will look like here, or they'll, instead of looking at the eyes, they're just like looking at the face. They almost feel like they're looking past you overall, where it doesn't feel connected. Anyone resonating with this kind of as I'm describing some of these traits and how it can, this is your son to a T. Okay. Um, yeah. So again, it can look very different. Sometimes too, we'll see like an over animation of like being so expressive and big and really like exaggerated all the time, which also can be a difference in nonverbal communication. Then we have the third bucket is the differences in social reciprocity, social emotional reciprocity. So this can be even having like insight into their own emotions and how they're feeling or how other people are feeling and being able to read those social cues. And again, it can be sometimes what we see is all, especially for kids that are more hypersocial, if someone's crying, they may be providing a lot of empathy and comfort and affection, but then they may have difficulty like reading the cues when they're not welcome somewhere, right? Like other kids are playing and they're not really paying attention and they're continuing to try. Or it could be, and we're going to get into this other bucket, the intense interest, where they're really like, they're just talking about their favorite thing. So, example, I was recently, this happens a lot. This is a common one, but cats tend to be more of an intense interest for, I find, in particular for autistic girls. And it's like, well, let me tell you everything about cats. And do you have a cat? And why don't you like cats? And sometimes it's like, it's not that I don't like cats, but it's like, why don't you have one? Blah, blah, blah. And it's like going and asking all these questions. Again, think about it. That can appear highly social, right? Oh, well, they're asking all these questions, but what is the quality in which they're doing it? Is it truly reciprocal, or are they just downloading or like what we call info dumping sometimes on you and giving you all the information where it doesn't have that back and forth nature? So those are some examples. Like I said, tons of them in the document. I structured it in a way where you have the criteria, you have example traits, and then you have a column where you can make notes. But any questions, real quick, I'll pause about this kind of difference in social communication and social interaction. One thing I will note is that spoken language is not part of the diagnostic criteria for autism. So in that's the thing. That doesn't automatically, if your child has a language delay, it doesn't automatically mean that they are autistic. And, one of the things is like, okay, what's causing that language delay? And is there a larger collection there as well? So, okay, let's go to bucket number like B here. Keeping in mind if questions pop up, just throw them in the chat. So this then is our kind of restricted behaviors, interests, that type of thing. And there's 4 areas here. So with these 4 areas, you actually only have to have 2 of the 4. So in bucket A, we had to have all 3 in order to fill that bucket. For bucket B, we only need to hit 2 of what I'm about to describe. The first one being repetitive, or what we call stereotypes, so more unusual or atypical body movements, language, or my brain just play with objects. I could not think of the word. So that's number 1, and we'll dive into what these look like. Number 2 are basically difficulty with change and transition. Number 3 is sensory differences, and number 4 is intense or focused interests. So with the repetitive stereotype body movements, play with objects, and language, here's some of what this can look like. We think about the classic, like, okay, flapping and rocking, that's a form of stimming that would fall under here, but it might be more subtle in your kids. So sometimes I'll see things like hand posturing, like they're holding their hands in a certain way, or they're like splaying them a lot. Sometimes it can be like more like stimming with something, like sitting, like rolling something or like rubbing something, that type of thing. This can also look like, and really we just have to have some evidence within this. You don't have to have all these things that I'm describing. It could be like lining things up, hair twirling. Yes, such a great one that is so often missed. Again, it can absolutely occur with boys, but I find it's more common with girls. A lot of times, too, people will write it off as anxiety as well, which commonly does co occur with autism, too. But sometimes it's like these more adaptive things in order to stim and regulate the body. We also can have like lining up organization type thing. So again, classic, it's like, okay, lining up cars, for example. It's like, okay, no, my kid doesn't do that, but does every stuffed animal have its exact place, right? And do you have to have a routine to put all those stuffed animals away as well, where it's like every time you leave the house, everyone needs to be in their little area? That could be an example of it as well. Can eye poking be one of these? So, Janine, I'd have to know a little bit more. It could potentially be. It also could be a sensory thing. And are they poking other people's eye, their own eye? If you want to put a little bit more detail in the chat, I can clarify where I think that could potentially fall. The other thing that falls into this first part is then what we call like more repetitive or stereotype language. So this can look like your child echoing you back, or like scripting from, lines of movies or TV shows, for example. And I think ultimately this sometimes can appear really subtle. One thing I want to mention is, in terms of autistic traits, this absolutely is an autistic trait. And it also could be how your child learns language. So, while I'm not going to fully get into this today, although I do have a podcast I'll share at the end. If you guys want to dive in, I can make some recommendations of episodes. But a huge portion of autistic children are what we call Gestalt language processors or Gestalt processors, where they learn in wholes and over time they learn to break it down. So I want you to think of a Lego creation. They learn about the creation first before they understand that these little parts or Legos create this creation, versus an analytic processor would learn about the little parts and then learn how to build it. And so with language, this often looks like going from, babbling to single words to two-word phrases to then more complex language. A lot of these Gestalt processors will have full scripts sometimes before they're even going to have single words, because they learn the scripts and then they learn to break it down. And sometimes these scripts aren't clear. Sometimes it can sound more like jargon, where it's like, "Rah, rah, rah, rah," right? And it's like, you want to do some detective work of like, what are they trying to communicate? And did they hear something that has that intonation, even though they're not clearly repeating the words? But that also is an autistic trait, in addition to how they learn language. So we want to support it, but it helps us justify diagnostic criteria. Okay, so then the second one, I don't know exactly what order I presented these in, but are difficulty with change and transition. So this could be moving away from a non-preferred or preferred activity to a non-preferred activity. It could look like if you cut your hair, they're really distressed and asking a ton of questions about it because it's a change. It could be they want to like drive the certain way to school, and if you drive a different way, they're like, what are you doing? It also can be difficulty, when routine changes up. So sometimes this can be more subtle and sometimes this can be more obvious. We tend to also find like a pattern of rigidity that is associated with this, of wanting things a certain way. Sometimes too, for more hypersocial kids, we can have it where they have to repeat, like they want us to say something in a certain way. And if you don't, right, like, and if you don't answer the question, they get very stuck, very perseverative. Their brain almost cognitively loops. My daughter is a Gestalt learning processor is really impactful for me. When my daughter was repeating Frozen to Anna, learning about love, and she would repeat the phrasing often, then moved on to use the word love appropriately in other contexts. That's a perfect example of it. Okay, he pokes his own eyes, mostly the left eye, with one finger from his left hand. He will do it more if there are new people or people he isn't around often. And if people give a big reaction, I was told that many kids do this. They do it to stimulate the nerve that creates the starry scene by sensory room. Yeah. So exactly. It could be a sensory thing of like wanting to feel that pressure. It also could potentially be stimming too. What I hear is when he's in novel situations or with novel people, my guess is anxiety is increasing. So hyper nervous system arousal is increasing. And so then he's trying to do this in order to self-regulate as a result. Oh my God, the driving when the freeway is closed down, it will cause a meltdown. Yeah. So these are examples of that. I'm being mindful of time. So I'm going to move a little quicker through these last few because I want to have a few things at the end about supports. So then we have the third area of focus interests or intense interests. Sometimes these are unusual too. Like I had, for example, a 4-year-old who knew every single country and would like tell, I mean, so knowledgeable, but would tell every single country, like to the point he was saying countries I did not even personally know. And that was part of our evaluation. Or it could be something, like cats, for example, and, really focused on that. And sometimes we'll even see role play with this of like they think they are a cat or a dog. I've had many, many sessions where, especially as anxiety increases, that the child will start like meowing or barking, and parents are like, what do we do with this? And it could be this intense interest. It's also a way to mask and to self regulate and to have a feeling of control in their world as well. So a lot of times I use it as a marker of distress. And so this can be so variable, and it's not necessarily, it could be info dumping, but it also could be something where it's just like they're constantly coming back. Now, one thing that I find happens a lot is sometimes, especially, and I'm not going to get into this a ton today, but there's something called the PDA profile. Stands for pathological demand avoidance or persistent drive for autonomy. It's not a diagnosis. It's something we're still learning a lot about. We still need lots of research about. But sometimes what I find with these types of kiddos, they tend to be higher masking. And it's really where their nervous system goes into this fight or flight mode much easier, like almost they're having a panic response, which can also be related to the eloping and the aggression and things like that. But sometimes we'll see the intense interest frequently change. And so it can be really confusing of like, okay, they go all in on this one topic for 2 to 3 months, and then all of a sudden they're done. They want nothing to do with that, but then that energy shifts to a new topic. And so sometimes people think those aren't intense interests, but the intensity is still there. It's just, it switches a lot. And then the fourth area are those sensory differences. So it could be like the eye poking of seeking something out, feeling something, seeing something in the visual field, like visual stimming, staring at things. It could also be like a lot of like crashing and jumping into things. And um like all of that. It also can be, so that's like sensory seeking. It also can be sensory aversion, like difficulty with food textures or certain clothing or sounds and things like that. Beth says understanding PDA has really helped with my son. Good, good. Stephanie said a lot of this seems to overlap with ADHD diagnosis. How can you tell the difference? This is where a comprehensive evaluation is helpful of like understanding, really these restricted repetitive behaviors are unique to autism. You can have some social differences with ADHD, but we're really looking for that pattern of inattention and hyperactivity and impulsivity. But you can see something like the sensory seeking, like crashing and jumping, could have a sensory component. It also could be hyperactivity. And so this is where we got to look at what the function of the behavior is to really understand. So you have to have 2 of these 4 in order to satisfy the bucket. Then we can say, okay, they are meeting diagnostic criteria for autism if we have bucket A and B. So what I would recommend you do, again, I'll share it here shortly, but going ahead and ultimately downloading that guide and going through and doing some reflection. And like I said, I find it really helpful to still do, even if you are your child's diagnosed, because then you can better understand how they're meeting diagnostic criteria for autism. So it helps you advocate. It also, I'm a big proponent too of helping you better understanding your child, their pattern of strengths and support needs, as well as your helping your child to understand themselves too. Really quick, and then I will take questions. I'm going to be super quick through this. So therapy, what this unlocks, is therapy services. A lot of times, and I think regardless, this is going to be helpful for a lot of your children with, with ZMYND 11. So speech therapy, for example, occupational therapy, focus a lot on like sensory regulation. Physical therapy, particularly if you're having the hypotonia going on, feeding therapy, all of that. And also it can help in advocating for an IEP at school if you're in the US or whatever sort of, formal specialized instruction that there is in your country. Again, in the US, someone mentioned this, it can help you qualify for Medicaid. A lot of states, as of now, of course, it could change, but a lot of states have autism waivers or developmental disability waivers that actually waive the income requirement too. So you're able to qualify for Medicaid even if you're above the pay threshold. My biggest thing that I want to emphasize, number one, presuming competence in your child, presuming that even if they don't have a way of always expressing themselves, that they are able to do something. We want to provide the right supports, but believing in their ability. Number two, finding a consistent mode of communication for them. I know you guys were talking about AAC, super important there. And I'd assess, is there apraxia? That was exactly where my brain went to when I was prepping for this presentation. But some sort of consistent mode of communication is if they don't have spoken language. With AAC, I heard you guys talk about like the stimming. Absolutely. And it is like babbling. But the biggest thing that I find too is with AAC, we have to do a ton of modeling without any expectation. So you as the parent actually using the device yourself. A speech language pathologist, Janine, can assess for apraxia, but you're going to want to check if they have that area of expertise because not everyone does. I think there's like apraxia.org, I believe it is, that can help you learn more information. But a consistent mode of communication is super important. Lots of modeling, lots of exposure to it, looking into Gestalt language processing. And the last piece that I want to end on is I think this isn't talked enough about. As you guys heard from the introduction, I grew up with an autistic brother. I saw how my parents were pretty unsupported in this process. In turn, I was unsupported. We were 10 years apart. I highly recommend that you also are seeking out at different stages therapy for yourself or having a safe space. And this community is amazing, but having a safe space that you can really process through your emotions. And I think that's something we don't talk about enough. I also think I understand it's so hard. You're juggling so much. It's like, well, I don't have space for this. What I will find is that when parents are getting support, their nervous systems are more well regulated. They have more capacity. And that in turn helps your child to regulate more because they're able to co-regulate with you. You're also doing a ton of modeling of taking care of yourself and how that's a priority. So your child is directly benefiting from you leaning into your own supports too. So, all right, let me know what questions. My son had developmental apraxia. We're taught to do a technique called owling. Is this still used? It really helped my son. I am not sure. You're so welcome, Patty. Oh, good, Jenny. I'm glad it resonated. There are a couple different ones. Actually, I'll go ahead real quick and share my slides so you can download a few things. So this is a QR code. I'll repaste it just in case it doesn't work. But there it is. So you guys can download that guide. And then just to answer your questions, on the next one, I'm going to show you my podcast. There is an episode on apraxia where we talk about ultimately like some of the various approaches and just it actually is with an adult who's was diagnosed with apraxia, and he does a lot of advocacy and sharing about that. So let me switch over. So here, oh, thank you. I'm so glad. Here's the podcast. So it is designed for parents of autistic kids. There are episodes, episode 4 and 114 are more on diagnostic criteria if you want to keep diving in. Um, ultimately, too, I would say episode 77 is on Gestalt language processing. Episode 159 is on apraxia. And then episode, I believe it's 125 and 126, yep, is a two-parter on AAC. So if you want to really learn how to introduce AAC in a way that will be supportive. So there is that. And then this QR code is my social media, my Instagram. I share lots of education. I'd love to, have you come on over and follow me there if you want. And then my handle is just the.dr.tay. And also there is my email in case you guys are needing anything, need continued resources. I love being able to be here. So thank you so much